Hey there, this is Jesse Spivak from New Visions for Public Schools. Today, I want to show you how to create a pre-populated Google form using Formula and the spreadsheet function substitute and concatenate. This technique will solve the problem of practice of programmatically creating pre-populated Google forms. When a user clicks on a pre-populated form link, the form will load with certain fields already completed. The values that get loaded into the form are passed into the form via URL. This makes more sense when thinking about how requests typically work in schools. For many of our schools, when a teacher submits a request for something, the approval process may seem arbitrary, not transparent, or worse, the request itself is lost in the piles of work schools are confronted with on a daily basis. What we need to be able to do is take a form to collect a request, like a student referral, and pass that information collected in the referral into a response form. So we're building a system with two forms, a request and response form. Some of the information in the request form will be preloaded into the response form using the pre-populate feature. Pre-populating a form can be used to make any type of form entry easier for the user. The less the user has to input into the form, the quicker it takes the person to complete the form. Also, through pre-population, you can ensure that forms are loaded with validated data, and therefore avoid spelling and other user mistakes. If you're still with me and still on board with this entire pre-population thing, hold on, because things are about to get real. Let's say that for the case of this video, we're building a system where a teacher can submit a referral for a student based on some criteria, like being late for class. Assume that we've set up this system so that when a teacher submits a referral, the student's advisor or guidance counselor or dean receives an email notification. In that email is a link to the second form in our system, which we use to log responses to the original referral. First, let's open up that response form. This is the form that the advisor, guidance counselor, or dean will open from the email that gets generated when the referral is submitted by a teacher. To access the form pre-population option, click on Responses, and then click Get Pre-filled URL. This will take us to what looks like the live form, except for the yellow banner at the top of the page. We'll answer questions that we want to pre-populate, and when we hit Submit, we'll get a URL with the pre-populated data for the form we just submitted. When I copy and paste this URL into a browser, the live form gets loaded with the information I had just selected in my example. Looking at the URL may seem confusing at first, but if you focus in on the individual components of the URL, you can begin to see how we can customize it and make it dynamically reference values in a spreadsheet. The first part of the URL is the section that takes us to the live form. If I were to just copy and paste the blue section of the link into my browser, I'm going to get the live form without any pre-populated data. After the question mark is where the URL stores the data to load into the form. Each entry and series of numbers corresponds to the ID of the form question. For example, the maroon entry.id is the field identifier for the student name question in my form. Notice how that field is being set equal to Joe plus West. That's how the form URL knows to load the student selector question with the name Joe West. The last form field, which I've color-coded green, is being preloaded with the words case and number. I do this to help me understand the form URL so it becomes easier to edit when I copy it into my spreadsheet. In order to make this URL dynamic, I'm going to use the concatenate function, which appends text together. You can separate the text by commas. So what we're going to do is use quotation marks, commas, and cell references to append a URL together that dynamically pulls in values from a spreadsheet. We're going to start by passing the URL into the spreadsheet that contains our student referral form responses. In this case, I'm pasting the URL into cell J2, which comes after my last form response cell in F2, and after a few formula columns I'm using to look up information on the form responses. Next, I'll wrap my entire URL in equals concatenate, open parentheses, open quotation marks, close parentheses. Now my concatenate function has one argument, the entire URL. I want to add additional arguments, so I'm going to break up the URL. First, I'll put a close quotation mark after the equal sign of the first field I want to pre-populate, which in this case is the student name field. I'll put a comma after the closed quotation mark, which now tells concatenate that the first argument has ended and to expect a second argument after the comma. My second argument, instead of Joe plus West, which is a static non-changing value, we're going to change to be a dynamic cell reference. In this case, I'm going to use cell C2, which corresponds to the cell in the referral form that contains the student name that I want to pass into the response form via pre-populated URL. I'm also going to add an additional argument in which I dynamically reference cell L3, the case number of the student referral. Case numbers are important because they are a unique value associated with each form entry and can be used in lookups in complex form-driven systems. Altogether, my dynamic form URL looks like this. When I copy and paste this from my spreadsheet into a browser navigation bar, I'll get the response form with the first question pre-populated with the value from cell C2 and the last question pre-populated with the value from cell L2, student name and case number respectively. Notice the syntax of the concatenate function. Text arguments are surrounded in quotation marks, and each argument is separated by commas. I do not need to put cell references in quotes. The problem of using a URL to build a pre-populated form is when we want to add a value into the form that contains a space. URLs can't have spaces, but in this case, I want to load in the name Joe West accurately. To do this, we'll use the substitute function, which looks at existing text, finds some text, and replaces it with something new. The first argument is the text to search, which would be our concatenated URL. The second argument is the text to search for, which would be a space, because we want to look in our concatenated URL for spaces. The third argument is the new text we want to substitute in for the old. In this case, it would be a plus sign, because we want to replace all the spaces we find in the URL with plus signs so that the URL can be used properly. To do this, I'm going to wrap my concatenated URL in the substitute function and then add two additional arguments, each separated by a comma. The first argument is the concatenated URL, which is the text I want to search. Next comes a comma and a second argument. In this case, it's a space surrounded by quotation marks, because I want to search the concatenated URL for spaces. Next comes a comma and the third argument, which is a plus sign surrounded by quotation marks, because I want to replace the spaces with plus signs. Altogether, the function should now look like this. I've put the concatenated URL we already created in black, and the new arguments and substitute function in red. The entire function I'll put into the second row of my referral request form in a column labeled follow-up URL. Remember, this is the spreadsheet containing the responses to the referral requests, but I also have some additional columns after the form response column, which give me the data's text, the student's advisor, the advisor's email address, and now the follow-up URL, which will open up the follow-up form with the information we've loaded into the URL using concatenate and substitute. If you don't have experience using lookups and formulas on form responses, before moving forward with this, you need to familiarize yourself with Formule, a New Vision's Google Apps script that has a ton of functionality, including copying down formulas and applying them to new form submissions. Andrew Stillman, creator of Formule, recently put together an amazing tutorial on this Formule technique. Once we have Formule running, I can automatically generate emails from the referral form, with any of the information collected in the form itself, like student name, reason for referral, date of referral, and notes. I can also load in any information looked up from the form response with Formule. In this case, I've looked up the advisor's name, Lizette Carmona, the email address of the advisor, and we've created a URL for a pre-populated response form. When Lizette clicks on the form link to log her response to the referral, the response will open and the response form will open and the values we pass in through the URL will appear in the form. Now Lizette doesn't have to enter the student's name, and we ensure that the correct case number is associated with this response. The case number we can then use to determine which referrals have been responded to and which are still open. If you're still with me, congratulations. You've made it through some very technical stuff. But the result of your efforts will be a new skill set that can be applied to many different problems facing schools.